deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog clings low and the ridges swallow whole towns. Whispers speak of a family that even the most hardened locals refuse to mention by name, the Winslow Clan. They weren't just feared, they were avoided, erased, like a stain, too dark to scrub clean. For generations, travelers vanished in the valleys where the Winslows roamed, and those who came back alive, they never spoke again, their eyes hollow, their voices trembling at even the mention of Red Gap, the place where the Winslows made their home. The legend begins in the mid-1800s with patriarch Jeremiah Winslow, a man described as more beast than human. He settled deep within a gulch that locals avoided, building a crude homestead from scavenged wood and stone. Jeremiah was said to be obsessed with blood purity, not in the noble sense, but in a twisted, self-serving way. He forbade his children from mingling with outsiders, demanding they marry only within the family. By the third generation, the Winslow bloodline was warped children born with extra fingers, faces slightly misshapen, eyes that seemed too wide into knowing. Unlike other Appalachian families whispered about for cannibalism, the Winslows weren't hunters in the traditional sense. They were collectors. Jeremiah believed every person had a dark essence that could be preserved, harnessed, and bound. When travelers disappeared, their bones weren't always gnawed clean. Sometimes, they were arranged into strange geometric shapes in the woods, like puzzle pieces forming symbols no one could read. Entire groves were found filled with bone, spirals, massive wheels of femurs and ribs, half buried in the soil as if feeding the land itself. The first official reports of the Winslows appeared in the 1870s, when railroad workers expanding through the mountains went missing. Search parties stumbled across a site that would haunt Appalachia's history forever, a clearing littered with bones, not scattered, but carefully organized into what resembled a giant, grotesque nest. Inside that nest were dozens of human skulls, stacked like eggs, each one polished smooth, their eye sockets painted with tar. It was unlike anything investigators had ever seen, and standing watch over the display was Jeremiah's son, Elias Winslow, his body towering, his skin pale, and his teeth filed into points. He didn't attack. He only smiled, blood dripping down his chin, before disappearing into the trees. That sighting ignited decades of fear. Locals claimed that the Winslows had a pact with something older than the mountains themselves. Witnesses swore the family performed rituals under the full moon, surrounding their bone spirals, chanting in a language no one recognized. Farmers miles away claimed to hear drums and screaming carried through the valleys, and when dawn came, they'd find livestock mutilated bodies, arranged in the same patterns as the bones. By the early 1900s, stories grew more grotesque. A preacher who traveled too close to Red Gap returned days later, clothes shredded, eyes gouged out, his tongue nailed into his own hand. He lived, but he never preached again. Another account told of a group of children who vanished on their way to school. Weeks later, their shoes were found hanging from trees along the ridges, each pair strung together with veins. What made the Winslows so feared wasn't just their brutality, was their precision. Everything they did had a pattern, an order, as if they were building something greater with each victim. The bone spirals grew larger. The jars of preserved organs multiplied. Some whispered the Winslows were constructing a cathedral of flesh, a place that would anchor their family forever, giving them power beyond death. But the most chilling accounts came from the few who claimed to escape the Winslow homestead. Survivors described walls made of bones, cemented with mud, floors tiled with skin, stretched taut like leather, and a central room where Jeremiah's descendants displayed their masterpiece, a throne assembled entirely from human spines. It was said the patriarch himself still sat there, his corpse upright, skin stretched tight, mouth twisted in a grin that never faded. The Winslows didn't just live in isolation, they created a kingdom of horror in the gulch, a dominion of fear carved from flesh and bone, and for over a century, no one dared challenge them. The law stayed out. Locals avoided Red Gap, and the legend of the Winslows grew darker with every whispered retelling. But as the years dragged on, one question gnawed at Appalachia. What happened to the Winslows? Did they vanish into the shadows, their rituals complete, their bloodline ended? Or are they still out there, perfecting their cathedral of bone waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble into Red Gap? One thing's certain, in Appalachia, some families build homes. The Winslows built nightmares, by the mid-20th century. The Winslow name had all but vanished from official records, yet the terror they spread only grew. Their bloodline had become warped from generations of inbreeding, producing figures so twisted in body and mind that they barely resembled the rest of humanity. But if the rumors were true, the deformities only seemed to fuel their obsession with ritual, with preservation, with the grotesque order they believed gave them power. The Winslow homestead at Red Gap was no longer a crude cabin. By the 1930s, survivors described a sprawling compound, cobbled together from scavenged timber, scavenged bones, and even slabs of stone stolen from abandoned graveyards. Some said the walls themselves pulsed faintly, as if the very structure was alive. At night, travelers reported hearing a chorus of screams echoing across the gulch, not of the living, but of the dead, trapped in whatever unholy cathedral the Winslows were building. The stories of their rituals became darker. Witnesses spoke of grotesque processions, dozens of pale, misshapen Winslow children carrying torches through the woods. Their faces were blank, emotionless, their mouths smeared with blood. They gathered around the massive bone spirals the family had been constructing for decades, adding new pieces to the ever-growing monuments. A missing hunter's ribcage would be woven into the circle, a lost hiker's skull polished and placed at the center. Each addition brought the structure closer to something purposeful, something monumental. Though no outsider ever saw the design completed, the Winslows' victims came from all walks of life. Moonshiners trying to cut through Red Gap, lovers sneaking into the woods for privacy, entire families broken down along the remote mountain trails. Those who didn't vanish entirely often reappeared weeks later, mutilated but alive, walking warnings of what happened to those who trespassed. One man, Thomas Avery, was discovered naked and bloodied along a rural road in 1942. His arms had been carved with spirals so deep the scars never healed, and his eyes had been removed, replaced crudely with animal teeth sewn into the sockets. He lived, but he never spoke, simply rocking back and forth until his death in an asylum years later. It wasn't just humans who suffered. Farmers found livestock butchered and displayed in precise patterns. Cows drained of blood, their hides stretched across frames like canvases. Chickens with their beaks stitched shut, hung from trees in circles. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were messages, warnings carved into the land itself. The Winslows weren't just killing, they were creating, turning every act of violence into a piece of their greater design. By the 1950s, Red Gap had become a cursed zone. Locals whispered that even the trees seemed wrong there, their branches twisting into shapes like skeletal hands. The soil was said to be blackened, heavy with ash and something darker. Hunters avoided the gulch, and even seasoned moonshiners charted longer routes to avoid passing too close. The few brave enough to step inside the hollow never lingered long. They spoke of shadows moving where there should be none, of children's laughter echoing from empty groves, and of an overwhelming sense of being watched. The most infamous account from this era came from a group of state troopers in 1961, tasked with investigating a rash of disappearances. They ventured into Red Gap one autumn night. Only 2 returned. Their testimony remains sealed, but leaked details describe a scene beyond comprehension. The troopers allegedly stumbled into the Winslow Cathedral, a clearing dominated by a massive structure, made entirely of human remains. Skulls, ribs, femurs, pelvises all arranged into a towering effigy that reached toward the treetops. And at its base, dozens of pale figures sat in silence, rocking in unison, their bodies covered in spirals carved into the flesh. When the troopers approached, the figures began to chant in a guttural, otherworldly rhythm, and from the shadows emerged a manor, what was once a man. He was described as impossibly tall, his body twisted with deformities, his jaw dislocated, teeth filed into points. Some claimed this was the last of Jeremiah Winslow's direct descendants, now a monstrous patriarch leading the clan into a new era of horror. The troopers opened fire, but the figure didn't fall. The two survivors fled into the woods. The others were never found. After that, Red Gap was abandoned completely. Officially, it was marked as unsafe terrain due to unstable ground, but the locals knew better. The Winslows were still there, still building, still perfecting their cathedral of bone. Their story became less of a tale of cannibalism and more of a myth of transformation, of a family so consumed by their own madness that they had transcended humanity, becoming something darker, something eternal. Yet the strangest part is this: reports of their rituals never stopped. Hunters still hear chanting in the distance. Explorers still stumble upon new bone spirals, freshly made. And every few years, someone still vanishes near Red Gap. The legend of the Winslow clan didn't end, it evolved. And with each generation, their horrors grew more refined, more deliberate, more terrifying. Because while others killed to survive, the Winslows never killed for need, they killed for design. And somewhere, in the depths of Appalachia, their work may still be unfinished. By the 1970s, the Winslow clan had become more legend than flesh. Locals told stories around campfires, warning children never to wander into Red Gap. Outsiders dismissed it as Appalachian folklore, just another tale to keep trespassers away. But the chilling truth was this: the stories never stopped. If anything, the sightings became stranger, darker, and harder to dismiss. Urban explorers began poking around Red Gap in the late 20th century, drawn by whispers of a cathedral made of bone. Some returned with bizarre finds, trees carved, with spirals so fresh the barks still bled sap. Fire pits surrounded by neatly arranged animal skulls, strange dolls woven from hair and sinew. Others didn't return at all, and when their belongings surfaced, abandoned tents, torn backpacks, cameras with shattered lenses, it only fueled the legend further. One of the most disturbing cases occurred in 1987, when two college students from Kentucky set out to document the Winslow myth for a thesis. They were found days later, staggering into a nearby town barefoot and bleeding. Their accounts were fragmented, but both described the same thing: a clearing filled with pale, inbred figures, swaying in silence around a massive effigy of bones. The figures didn't attack, but they whispered, voices in unison. Voices that grew louder and louder until the students blacked out. One of the students was so traumatized he clawed his own ears until he was deaf. The other took his life 2 years later, leaving behind a note that simply read, "The spiral never ends." Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Red Gap became a magnet for ghost hunters and amateur thrill seekers with camcorders. Grainy videos surfaced online showing crude altars, skeletal remains posed in unnatural ways, and faint chanting captured on tape. But the most unsettling footage came from 2004, when a group of explorers found a cellar beneath a collapsed farmhouse near the gulch. Inside, the walls were covered in spirals carved into stone, and shelves lined with cloudy jars holding unrecognizable shapes. In the final moments of the tape, a shadow moves across the cellar wall, tall, misshapen, walking on limbs too long to be human. The video ends abruptly. None of the explorers were ever seen again. Authorities occasionally attempted to sweep the area, but official reports were inconclusive. Animal remains, they'd say. Teenagers playing pranks, but locals knew better. Too many hunters still heard music at night, haunting fiddle tunes and hollow, bone-like flutes carried on the wind. Too many hikers found carefully arranged symbols in the dirt, and too many missing person cases still clustered around Red Gap. The modern theory is perhaps the most chilling of all, that the Winslow clan never died out. They adapted. No longer tied to a single homestead, they roam Appalachia, building their spirals and monuments wherever they go. Evidence of Winslow-style rituals has appeared hundreds of miles from Red Gap abandoned barns, with bone lattice nailed to the rafters, campgrounds with spiral carvings burned into the soil, even suburban woods where hikers stumble across crude thrones made of animal remains. Are these the descendants of Jeremiah Winslow, carrying their family's legacy of design forward? Or are they imitators, inspired by whispers of the clan? The answer may not matter, because, whether born Winslow or merely possessed by their ideology, the horror continues. And unlike other clans that fade into obscurity, the Winslow's obsession has only grown more virile, more infectious. One recent account, in 2018, described a family camping trip gone horribly wrong. They reported hearing chanting just beyond the tree line. When they investigated, they found dozens of crude stick figures hung from branches, their bodies tied together with strips of skin. The father swore he saw movement in the tree's pale faces with wide, unblinking eyes. The family fled in terror, abandoning their gear. When police searched the site, the stick figures were gone. Every single one. The Winslow legend now exists in a liminal space, half folklore, half ongoing nightmare. You'll hear truckers swapping tales of strange figures on back roads, their bodies bent and twisted in inhuman ways. You'll hear hikers whisper of hearing music in the dark, only to find spirals carved into the earth beneath their feet at sunrise. And always, always, the same warning. If you hear whispers in Red Gap, don't listen, don't look, don't follow. Because the Winslows don't just kill, they collect. They don't just eat, they preserve. And if their cathedral of bone is still unfinished, then every disappearance, every spiral, every jar of flesh is just another step toward completion. And that begs the question, what happens when it's finally finished? Asterisk. The Winslow clan weren't just killers. They were architects of horror, obsessed with patterns and spirals that turned human suffering into a grotesque design. And if the stories are true, their cathedral of bone was never completed, which means, somewhere in Appalachia, they may still be building piece by piece, victim by victim. But the Winslows are only one nightmare carved into these mountains. There are other families, other bloodlines, each with their own twisted legacy, some even darker, some even more disturbing. So if you want to keep uncovering Appalachia's most horrifying secrets, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and drop a comment below. Would you step into Red Gap for just one night? Or would you rather stay far, far away? And remember, out here in the hollows, some families don't just remember their dead, they keep building with them.